Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive into something truly fascinating? We're talking personal space today, that invisible bubble we all have. The one that makes us flinch when someone gets a little too close.
Or jump out of our skin at a sudden noise.
Exactly. It might seem simple, but personal space is actually a window into our brains, our evolution, and how we interact with the world around us.
And even how we interact with each other.
For this deep dive, we're turning to neuroscientist Michael Graziano and his book, The Spaces Between Us.
Graziano spent years researching this, first with monkeys, then with humans, and his work really gets to the heart of what makes us tick.
One thing I found particularly interesting is that he even weaves in his personal story about his own son who had challenges with personal space.
Which adds this whole other layer of depth to our exploration, a reminder that these scientific concepts have real-world implications.
Exactly. It's not just theory. It's something that affects real lives in profound ways. So our mission today is to unravel how this invisible second skin, as Graziano calls it, influences everything.
From our jump scares to those subtle social cues we all send and receive.
To even things like, get this, smiling and laughing.
That's right. Even those seemingly simple expressions are tied to this complex system of personal space.
Who knew personal space had such a rich history, right? But first, let's talk about a universal experience. The startle reflex, that oh so relatable moment when something unexpected happens.
You jump a mile,
Yeah, exactly. It's more than just being jumpy, though. It's deeply tied to survival.
particularly protecting our vision. Think about it. When something unexpected comes at you, what's your first instinct?
To duck and cover.
Well, yeah, but even before that, you instinctively squint or flinch, trying to shield your eyes.
It's like when you walk outside on a bright summer day. You're not about to attack the sun, you're just protecting your eyes from that sudden burst of light.
Exactly. And the intensity of that reaction can actually tell us a lot about someone's emotional state. Research has shown that people who are anxious, for instance, tend to have a more pronounced startle reflex.
So it's like our bodies are subconsciously broadcasting our internal state, letting others know if we're feeling chill or on edge.
Precisely. It's fascinating how much our bodies reveal without us even realizing it. And this brings us to another pioneer in the study of personal space.
Okay, who are we talking about now?
Heine Hedegaard, a Swiss zoologist who was observing animals both in zoos and in the wild. He coined the term flight zone.
Ah, yes, the flight zone. That invisible boundary around an animal that, if crossed, triggers, well, flight.
Exactly. And Hedegaard's key insight was that self-preservation is the most powerful drive, even more so than the need for food or sex.
Okay, that makes sense. You can't exactly enjoy a good meal or, well, anything else if you're not alive to experience it.
Precisely. And there's this great anecdote in the book where Hedegaard is flying over Europe and notices how even human landscapes are divided up into these territories.
Just like in the animal kingdom.
Exactly. So whether we're consciously aware of it or not, we're all driven to stake out and protect our little piece of the world.
It's that primal instinct to control our immediate environment, to create a buffer between ourselves and potential threats.
Which makes perfect sense from an evolutionary perspective.
Okay, but what about us modern humans? We don't exactly have predators lurking around every corner, at least not in the literal sense. Has our reliance on personal space diminished?
That's a great question. And Hedegaard actually believed that, in a sense, humans have lost their flight zone.
You mean like we've become so domesticated, so accustomed to our controlled environments that this primal instinct has faded away?
That was his theory. He felt that our modern lives had made us less attuned to those subtle cues of danger and less reliant on personal space for survival.
I'm not so sure about that. I mean, I still have those moments where I definitely crave my space, those times when being too close for comfort just feels wrong?
You're absolutely right. It's more nuanced than Hedegaard perhaps realized.
Mhm.
Personal space isn't just about physical safety. It's also about our emotional and social comfort.
It's about setting boundaries, creating a sense of psychological as well as physical space.
Precisely. Which brings us to Edward Hall, an anthropologist who introduced the term proxemics.
Proxemics.
Yeah, as the study of how humans use space. And Hall had some rather interesting observations about how different cultures perceive personal space.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about some of his work. Some of his comparisons might be considered a bit, well, eyebrow-raising today. putting it mildly. But the important thing is that he brought attention to the fact that these unwritten rules of personal space, they can vary wildly across cultures. What might feel perfectly normal in one culture can be incredibly intrusive in another.
So it's not just about individual preferences, it's also about cultural norms and expectations.
Exactly. And Hall also made this interesting distinction between what he called the personal bubble, like that close comfort zone we all have, and the magic ring.
The magic ring, what's that?
It's that larger perimeter around individuals of power or authority. He used the example of President Kennedy, who apparently commanded this unspoken 30-foot perimeter wherever he went.
Wow, 30 feet, that's a pretty big bubble. It is. But it wasn't that Kennedy personally needed all that space. It was that everyone else instinctively expanded their distance.
Out of respect or deference, I guess.
Exactly. So it's this interesting interplay. Sometimes personal space isn't just about keeping others out. It's also about the people around us adjusting their own boundaries in response to us.
So it's a two-way street. Our personal space influences how others behave, and their behavior influences our sense of personal space.
It's a fascinating dance, this constant negotiation of boundaries and comfort zones.
Okay, so we've talked about the social and cultural aspects of personal space, but how about the brain itself? What's going on in there when it comes to this invisible bubble?
That's where Graziano's research gets really interesting. And it all starts with his work on monkeys.
So how do you even study personal space in a monkey?
Well, back then, a common practice in neuroscience was to use what's called an anesthetized prep method.
Anesthetized prep. So they were putting the monkeys to sleep.
Yes, ethically, of course, this was standard procedure at the time. And then they would use electrodes to monitor the monkey's brain activity while presenting it with various stimuli.
Like images on a screen or something?
Exactly. Pretty standard stuff. But Graziano decided to shake things up a bit.
I like where this is going. What did he do?
He went, as he puts it in the book, off the rails.
Off the rails! That's awesome.
Instead of just showing the monkeys these flat images on a screen, he started using a ping pong ball on a stick.
A ping pong ball on a stick?
Yeah, he wanted to see how the brain reacted to an object moving in three-dimensional space, something more dynamic and realistic.
It seems like such a small change, but I bet it had a big impact on their findings.
It did. It was a stroke of genius, really. What they discovered was remarkable. A specific set of neurons that fired wildly whenever that ping pong ball got close to the monkey's body.
Like an alarm system going off.
Exactly. It was as if the monkey had this built-in bubble wrap, a neural shield protecting it from bumps and intrusions, and they meticulously mapped these bubble wrap neurons, as we're calling them, in the monkey's brain.
So they found the actual brain cells responsible for detecting intrusions into personal space.
That's right. And what really surprised them was that these neurons weren't just responding to visual input. They were also firing when the monkey heard or felt something close by.
So it wasn't just about seeing the object, it was about sensing its presence in a multisensory way.
Exactly. It suggests that our sense of personal space isn't limited to one sense, but rather a complex integration of all of our senses, working together to create that protective bubble around us.
Which makes sense because our personal space isn't just about what we see, it's about everything we perceive around us. So how does our brain keep track of all these things, especially when we can't see?
Now that's where things get even more interesting.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more.
Graziano and his team wanted to understand how the brain constructs a sense of space in the absence of visual cues.
So how do we know something's getting close if we can't see it?
That's a huge challenge because, unlike vision or touch, our sense of auditory space isn't as straightforward. It relies heavily on echoes and reverberations. Think about how bats and dolphins use echolocation to navigate and hunt in the dark.
Wow, so it's like we have our own version of echolocation, even if we're not as skilled as bats or dolphins.
Exactly. It's not as sophisticated, but we do have this ability to sense when we're about to bump into something, even with our eyes closed. It used to be called facial vision, this almost sixth sense for detecting nearby objects.
I've totally experienced that, especially when I'm fumbling around in the dark. It's like my face knows where things are, even when my eyes can't see them.
And Graziano's team actually discovered the neurons responsible for this facial vision. They found specific neurons that fired whenever an object got close to the monkey's face, even in total darkness.
They could actually pinpoint the brain cells that are firing in response to an invisible object. That's incredible.
It was a major breakthrough. And these kissing in the dark neurons, as they call them, were remarkable for another reason.
What's that?
They could actually maintain a memory of the object's location, even when the monkey's head moved.
So even though the monkey couldn't see the object, its brain was still able to track its position in space, like an internal radar system.
Exactly. It's a testament to the brain's amazing ability to construct a spatial map of the world around us, even when we're deprived of visual information.
So we've got these specialized neurons firing whenever something enters our personal space. But what happens when you directly stimulate those neurons?
Now, that's where the real surprises started to emerge.
I bet. What did they find?
Well, they were expecting to see some kind of complex movement, like maybe the monkey would reach out and grab the object.
Makes sense. They'd found these neurons that fire when something gets close, so you'd think stimulating them would trigger some kind of action, right?
Exactly. But that's not what happened at all. Instead, what they got was, well, defensive flinching. Every time.
Really? So activating these neurons didn't trigger an elaborate reaching motion, but rather a basic protective response.
Exactly. And it was kind of a head-scratcher at first. Graziano himself admits in the book that he really struggled with this finding. He didn't want to believe that these neurons were just about flinching.
He had this vision of them being involved in much more sophisticated actions, something more complex than just a basic reflex.
Right, exactly. But it turns out that their initial approach was actually obscuring the true function of these neurons. You see, for over a century, neuroscientists have been using these brief bursts of stimulation when studying the motor cortex, just enough to trigger a quick muscle twitch.
So it's like they were only getting a tiny snapshot of the system's potential, like tapping on the door instead of actually walking through it.
That's a great analogy.
Hmm?
And because they were only using these short bursts, they were missing the bigger picture, this whole defensive aspect of the personal space system.
So what happened when they finally decided to try longer bursts of stimulation?
It was a complete game changer.
Mm.
With the longer stimulation, the monkey didn't just flinch, it went into a full-blown defensive posture. Arm raised, face contorted, the whole shebang. It was like they had finally woken up the entire personal space system.
It's like they finally managed to have a real conversation with those neurons instead of just exchanging quick hellos.
Exactly. And this breakthrough completely changed their understanding of how the motor cortex works. It wasn't just a simple puppet master pulling strings, but a much more complex network capable of producing a whole range of behaviors.
Okay, this raises a really important question. If these personal space neurons are primarily about flinching and defense, how do we manage to do all those intricate things that require us to get close to objects? You know, things like reaching for a cup of coffee or writing or even threading a needle.
That's where the concept of a margin of safety comes in. It's not that these neurons are only about flinching. It's that their activity levels create a whole spectrum of responses. Instead of a simple on-off switch, it's more like a dimmer switch.
So the intensity of the neural activity determines the intensity of the response.
Exactly. So instead of a full-blown flinch, you might get a subtle adjustment in an ongoing movement, a slight shift in trajectory to avoid a potential collision.
It's like this constant subconscious negotiation between our actions and our surroundings, all orchestrated by these personal space neurons. We're not always consciously aware of it, but it's happening all the time, keeping us safe and allowing us to interact with the world in a fluid and graceful way.
Precisely. Imagine trying to navigate a crowded room or a busy street without this system constantly working in the background.
It would be total chaos. We'd be bumping into each other left and right.
Exactly. And it's not just about avoiding things that are actually touching us. It's about maintaining this buffer zone, this margin of safety around our bodies.
Which makes me think about those instances where that system seems to go a bit haywire, you know? Like, have you ever been walking down the street and someone comes a little too close for comfort and you have this almost instinctive urge to step back?
Oh, absolutely. That's our personal space system in action. That primal instinct kicking in to maintain that protective buffer.
And it's not always a conscious decision, is it? It's like an automatic response, a reflex almost.
Right. Which brings us to the fascinating world of how brain damage can reveal the inner workings of personal space. Because sometimes by studying what happens when things go wrong, we can gain a deeper understanding of how the system normally functions.
So when it comes to personal space, what kind of insights can we glean from studying brain damage?
Well, one of the most striking examples is a condition called hemispatial neglect, which often occurs after a stroke.
I've heard of that. It's a fascinating but also quite heartbreaking condition. Imagine waking up one day and half of your world has literally vanished from your perception.
It's not just that you don't see it, it's that you don't even register it as being there. It's like that entire side of space has simply ceased to exist for you.
And I understand that it's typically the left side of space that's affected because the damage usually occurs on the right side of the brain.
That's right. And it's not that they can't physically see the left side, it's that they don't attend to it. They don't process it as being part of their world.
So, someone with hemispatial neglect might, for example, only eat the food on the right side of their plate or only dress the right side of their body.
Exactly. They might even shave only half of their face.
Wow. It's almost as if their brain has drawn a line down the middle of their reality and erased everything on one side.
It's a profound illustration of how the brain constructs our experience of space.
And what's really interesting is that, in some cases, the damage seems to specifically target the personal space system while leaving the processing of what we might call far space intact.
Right. They might be able to describe objects across the room but struggle to interact with anything near their body.
So they can see things in the distance, but their immediate surroundings, that close-in bubble of personal space, is somehow disrupted.
Exactly. And because of this damage to their personal space system, they become, in a sense, super flinchers. They're overly sensitive to anything entering that close-in bubble because their brain is essentially overcompensating for the damage.
It's trying to protect them from potential threats that they're not fully aware of.
Exactly. So studying these cases of brain damage is helping scientists pinpoint the specific neural networks involved in personal space. But how do we know that this system is active in everyday life in people who haven't experienced brain damage?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because it's not like we're walking around constantly flinching or feeling threatened. Our personal space system is usually operating in a much more subtle way.
Right, it's working in the background, making those micro adjustments that allow us to move through the world seamlessly.
Right, like a silent guardian, always watching, always protecting.
Exactly. But researchers have come up with some clever experiments to tease out those subtle effects.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me about these experiments.
Well, there's one where they manipulate your attention
Mm-hmm.
and then measure your reaction time to a touch.
Okay, I'm following so far.
So imagine you're sitting at a table and you're focusing your attention on your left hand. You're not looking at your right hand. You're just consciously focusing on your left hand.
Okay, got it.
Now, while you're doing that, a light flashes near your right hand. Even though you're not directly looking at the light, it's still registering in your peripheral vision.
Right.
And here's the fascinating part. That light, even though you're not consciously attending to it, will actually slow down your reaction time to a touch on your left hand.
So even though I'm focused on my left hand, the light near my right hand is somehow interfering with my ability to sense a touch on that same hand.
Exactly. It's as if that light near your right hand is grabbing your attention, even though you're trying to focus elsewhere. And by moving the light around, researchers can actually map out this bubble of space around the hand where visual stimuli have the strongest effect on touch perception.
So it's like our brains are constantly monitoring the space around us, even when we're not consciously aware of it.
And what's really cool is that this effect isn't limited to visual stimuli. They can also use sounds or even just the threat of a touch to create that same interference effect.
Wow. So it's not just about seeing something in our personal space, it's about any kind of sensory input that signals a potential intrusion.
Exactly. It suggests that our personal space system is multisensory, integrating information from all of our senses to create that protective bubble around us.
This makes me think about another really interesting aspect of personal space, its connection to our use of tools. Because as humans, we don't just navigate our own bodies through the world, we also interact with objects.
And often those objects become extensions of ourselves.
You're talking about tools, right? Like a hammer, a pen, our smartphones.
Exactly. These tools become so integrated into our daily lives that we almost forget they're separate objects.
They become part of our extended selves in a way.
Right. And this is where the concept of personal space takes an even more mind-blowing turn.
Okay, I'm ready for it. Hit me with the mind-blowing stuff.
All right. Imagine for a second that we're back in the Stone Age. You're Homo habilis, and you're trying to make a stone tool. You're holding this big rock and hammering at it with another rock. Seems simple enough, right?
Sure, until you miss and smash your hand or your knee. Not exactly conducive to tool-making success.
Exactly. So how did our ancestors avoid turning their tool-making endeavors into self-inflicted injuries?
It seems like there would have to be some kind of mechanism in place to prevent that. Otherwise, our tool-using days would have been very short-lived.
That's right. And here's where the brain's incredible ability to adapt comes in. What's fascinating is that our brains can actually incorporate tools into our body schema. It's as if the tool becomes an extension of ourselves, and with that extension comes an extension of our margin of safety.
So it's not just about aiming the tool correctly, it's also about protecting the space around the tool as if it were part of our own body.
Precisely. And there's research on patients with hemispatial neglect that supports this idea. Remember how they often neglect the left side of their body? Well, they'll also neglect the space around a tool they're holding in their right hand. It's as if the tool itself has become part of their left side.
So their personal space, or rather their lack of awareness of it, extends to encompass the tool they're using.
Exactly. It's a powerful demonstration of how adaptable our personal space is. It can expand and contract, not just based on our emotional state, but also based on the tools we're using.
Which makes perfect sense, because if we're going to use tools effectively, we need to be able to factor them into our spatial awareness. It's not just about our bodies anymore, it's about our bodies plus whatever we're holding or wielding.
And that has huge implications for understanding how tool use evolved. This flexibility, this ability to extend our personal space to encompass our tools, was likely crucial for our ancestors to start using tools safely and effectively.
It's a fascinating example of how our brains, our bodies, and our technology have co-evolved. We've shaped our tools, and our tools have shaped us.
Exactly. It's this ongoing feedback loop between our biology and our technology.
Okay, but here's the million-dollar question that's been bugging me this whole time. If we're so hardwired to maintain this defensive bubble around ourselves, how on earth do we manage intimacy? Kissing, hugging, cuddling, all those things require a significant breach of personal space.
That's a great question, and it highlights another crucial aspect of personal space. It's dynamism. It's not static. It's constantly adjusting based on context, emotions, and our relationship with the person we're interacting with.
So when you're feeling threatened, your bubble gets bigger. But when you're with someone you trust, it shrinks.
Exactly. And this fluctuation in personal space becomes a powerful form of nonverbal communication, especially in intimate relationships.
Like with kissing, for example. It's fascinating when you think about it. You're literally pressing your mouth, which is full of teeth, against another person's most vulnerable areas.
It's a bold move, evolutionarily speaking. You're literally putting yourself within striking distance of someone else.
But it's also a beautiful expression of trust and intimacy.
Yeah.
You're signaling that you're lowering your defenses, allowing someone to enter your most protected space.
And the neck is a particularly interesting example. It's such a vulnerable area, so heavily defended, that it becomes a focal point for intimacy. Kissing someone on the neck, it's almost like a symbolic bite, a playful reminder of those primal instincts that we usually keep in check.
And speaking of primal instincts, this might explain why vampires are often portrayed as alluring, even though they literally feed on our blood.
It's that exaggerated violation of personal space, that sense of danger and surrender that can be both terrifying and exciting.
It taps into that primal fear of having our personal space invaded, but in a way that's both thrilling and, in the context of fiction, safe.
Exactly. It allows us to explore those boundaries, to play with the idea of vulnerability and intimacy in a way that's both exciting and safe.
It's amazing how these seemingly simple acts of intimacy are layered with so much evolutionary baggage.
But personal space isn't just about our own individual bubbles. It also seems to extend to others. Have you ever experienced that phenomenon of sympathetic cringing?
Sympathetic cringing.
Like when you see someone about to walk into a glass door and you flinch as if you're about to hit it yourself.
Oh, absolutely. It's like my body's trying to protect them, even though I'm not the one in danger.
Exactly. Graziano describes this experience in his book. He was on the Great Wall of China with his son, and he talks about this almost physical sensation of cringing as his son got too close to the edge.
Even though he knew his son was perfectly safe.
Right. It's that instinctive empathy, that shared experience of personal space that makes us react as if we're the ones in this situation.
Like we're mirroring their experience in our own bodies.
Exactly. And it highlights how interconnected our personal space systems are. It's not just about protecting ourselves, it's also about reacting to the perceived threats to others, especially those we care about.
So it's not just me, myself, and I. It's also about you, them, us. We're all connected through this invisible web of personal space.
And that mirroring, that shared experience of personal space, might even hold the key to understanding how some of our most basic social signals evolve.
Okay, you've really got my attention now. What do you mean?
Well, think about smiling, laughing, and crying. These seemingly complex expressions are actually fundamental to human communication, and Graziano proposes that they might have evolved from those same defensive mechanisms we see in personal space.
Wait, so you're saying our smiles, our laughter, our tears, they might all be rooted in this primal urge to protect ourselves. That's a pretty radical idea.
It is, but when you look at the similarities between these social signals and defensive actions, it starts to make a lot of sense.
Okay, so how does this work with a smile, for example?
Well, think about the physical components of a smile. The squinting eyes, the raised upper lip. It actually resembles that instinctive facial contortion we make when we're startled or trying to protect our face.
So a smile is like a toned down, socially acceptable version of a defensive cringe. We've taken this primal reflex and turned it into a way to signal friendliness and approachability.
Exactly. It's not just a human thing either.
Yeah.
Many primate species have similar facial expressions that serve as appeasement signals, ways to de-escalate potential conflict and convey non-aggression.
It's fascinating how evolution can take these basic survival mechanisms and repurpose them for social interaction.
And what about laughter?
Yeah.
Especially that breathless, gasping kind of laughter. It often happens in situations where we're pushing the boundaries of personal space, like in a playful wrestling match or when someone tickles us.
Yeah, you're right. It's that kind of laughter that almost sounds like a struggle, like we're trying to catch our breath.
Exactly. And Graziano's idea is that laughter might have originally evolved as a signal to de-escalate those play fights, to communicate, hey, I'm okay, this is all in good fun, don't take it seriously.
So it's a way to acknowledge the violation of personal space, but also to reassure the other person that it's not a real threat.
Precisely. And over time, as with the smile, this signal might have become more generalized, evolving into the various forms of laughter we use today to express amusement, joy, and social connection.
It's amazing to think that something as joyful and liberating as laughter might have its roots in something as primal as self-defense.
It really highlights the ingenuity of evolution,
Mm.
how it can take these basic survival mechanisms and transform them into something so complex and nuanced.
Okay, so we've covered smiles and laughter. What about crying? That seems like the opposite of laughter, but I'm guessing it also ties into this idea of personal space.
It does, and in some ways, it's even more fascinating. While laughter might be a toned-down version of a defensive response, crying seems like an amplified version.
I see what you mean. The
Mm,
clenched face, the gasping breaths, the tears streaming down. It's like an all-out expression of distress and vulnerability.
Exactly. And Graziano suggests that crying evolved as a way to elicit care and comfort from others.
Mm.
It's an exaggerated signal of distress, drawing attention to our vulnerability and triggering a nurturing response in those around us.
So, in a way, it's like the ultimate manipulation of personal space. It's using our vulnerability to draw others closer, to break down those barriers and forge a connection.
It's a powerful demonstration of how personal space isn't just about keeping people out. It's also about strategically letting them in when the situation demands it.
And this brings us to a very personal aspect of this whole discussion. Because as intriguing as all this science is, it's important to remember that these aren't just abstract concepts. They have real-world implications for how we understand and interact with one another.
And for Graziano, this wasn't just an intellectual exercise. It was deeply personal because his own son struggled with issues related to personal space.
Yes, that's the part of the book that really stayed with me. Graziano shares his experience raising a son with dyspraxia, a condition that affects movement and coordination.
And a key component of his son's dyspraxia was a difficulty with personal space. He had trouble judging those boundaries, those invisible lines we all navigate so effortlessly.
It's so easy to take for granted this ability to regulate our personal space, but for some people, it's a real struggle, and it can have a profound impact on their lives.
Absolutely. And Graziano's story highlights just how challenging it can be, both for the individual and for their family.
So, what were some of the specific challenges his son faced?
Well, because he couldn't quite grasp those unspoken rules of personal space, he was constantly bumping into people, standing too close, making movements that others perceived as awkward or even intrusive.
And I imagine that must have been incredibly frustrating for him, like trying to speak a language where you don't understand the grammar.
Exactly, a language where the rules are all about these subtle cues of physical proximity and nonverbal communication.
Hmm.
And tragically, his difficulties with personal space led to some really serious social consequences.
What do you mean?
Well, at one point, he was actually expelled from school.
Expel? That's awful. What happened?
The school labeled him as sexually assaultive, simply because he was bumping into other kids and didn't understand those unspoken rules of personal space.
Wow, that's a really disturbing example of how a lack of understanding and empathy can have devastating consequences. It shows how important it is to recognize that personal space isn't always a conscious choice, that for some people it's a real struggle.
Absolutely. We need to be more aware of these differences, more compassionate, and create environments that are truly inclusive and understanding.
So, what happened with Graziano's son after he was expelled? Did they find a way to help him?
Yes, they did. And this is where the story takes a really hopeful turn. They discovered a key factor that was contributing to his son's dyspraxia, and that was his vestibular system.
The vestibular system, that's the inner ear, right? The one that helps with balance and spatial orientation.
Exactly. And it turns out his son's vestibular system wasn't functioning optimally, which had a cascading effect on his ability to process spatial information and coordinate his movements.
So it was like his internal GPS was a bit off, making it difficult to navigate the world, including that subtle dance of personal space.
That's a great way to put it. And it makes perfect sense when you think about how closely the vestibular system is linked to personal space. Remember those bubble wrap neurons we talked about? They rely heavily on input from the vestibular system to accurately map out the space around the body.
So if that vestibular foundation is shaky, the whole system is thrown off.
Precisely. And for Graziano's son,
Hmm.
this vestibular issue explains so much. The bumping into people, the awkward movements, the difficulty with writing, even his struggles with personal space, it was all stemming from this underlying sensory processing problem.
It's amazing, isn't it? Something seemingly unrelated to personal space, like the inner ear, it have such a profound impact on our social interactions.
It really highlights the complexity of the brain and the interconnectedness of our sensory systems.
So what did they do to address this vestibular issue? Was there any way to help him improve his sense of balance and spatial awareness?
They started doing these astronaut training exercises.
Astronaut training.
Yeah, the kind NASA uses to help astronauts adapt to zero gravity.
Astronaut training for dyspraxia. That's incredible. How does that even work?
It might sound unconventional, but it can be incredibly effective. These exercises involve a lot of head tilting, spinning, and other movements that stimulate the vestibular system.
So they were basically giving his son's vestibular system this intense workout, helping him recalibrate his internal GPS.
Exactly. And for Graziano's son, it made a huge difference. His balance improved, his spatial awareness sharpened, and his social interactions became much smoother. He was finally able to navigate personal space with more confidence and less awkwardness.
It's a true testament to the brain's plasticity, its ability to adapt and change, even in the face of significant challenges.
It's a reminder that even when things seem really difficult, there's always potential for improvement.
So, after the astronaut training, was Graziano's son able to go back to school?
He was. After a long legal battle and a lot of advocacy from his parents, he was finally able to attend a new school that was much more understanding and supportive of his needs.
That's fantastic. It must have been such a relief for him and his family.
It was a huge victory. And in this new, more supportive environment, he thrived. He made friends, he excelled academically, and most importantly, he was finally able to just be himself without judgment or fear.
It's a really beautiful ending to what could have been a much different story.
It is. And it speaks to the transformative power of empathy and understanding. When we take the time to really see the world through another person's eyes, to recognize their struggles and celebrate their strengths, we can create a space for them to truly flourish.
It's such an important message, and it brings us back to this core idea of personal space, not just as a physical boundary, but as a reflection of our shared humanity.
Exactly. Personal space isn't just about physical distance. It's about respecting individual differences, acknowledging invisible challenges, and creating a world that's more inclusive and compassionate.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the fascinating world of personal space, I'm left with this incredible sense of awe and wonder. This invisible bubble that we all carry around, it's so much more than just a buffer zone. It's a reflection of our evolution, our emotions, our relationships, and our deepest social connections.
It's a reminder that even the most mundane aspects of our lives, the way we move, the way we interact, are shaped by these complex forces that we often don't even realize are at play.
And for those who struggle with personal space, it's a call for greater empathy and understanding. Their challenges are real, their experiences are valid, and they deserve our support.
Absolutely. So the next time you feel that urge to step back or you sense that someone is a bit too close for comfort, remember, personal space is a complex and fascinating phenomenon. It's a window into our brains, our bodies, and our shared humanity.
And maybe, just maybe, if we can all become more aware of these invisible forces that shape our interactions, we can create a world where everyone feels safe, respected, and understood. That's something worth thinking about. And on that note, we hope you've enjoyed exploring the spaces between us. Until next time, keep diving.